a bunch of other countries, really, including Belarus. And the HAPS team have asked me to talk to you about Belarus today and the dramatic events we've kind of seen over the last week or so there. And yeah, it's been pretty intense there, you could say. And I want to kind of answer three questions, which are really like what is happening, why it's happening, and crucially, I think what happens next. Um, just because Belarus is obviously not a topic that maybe gets so much coverage in the press outside kind of moments of extreme crisis like the one that's happening now. So I'll try and kind of explain what exactly is the significance and what is happening really. So basically, if you've heard of anything about Belarus ever really, it's usually restricted to a couple of cliches, which is basically that it's the last dictatorship in Europe. It's a very famous one, and that it's kind of a Soviet time capsule. Both of those things are to some extent true. Um, it is a dictatorship, although there are other dictatorships in Europe. And it is a Soviet time capsule in many ways. You know, going to Belarus, as I do quite regularly, it's incredibly clean. It's incredibly uncommercialized in a really kind of weird, slightly vintage Soviet way. So yeah, it's a very strange country, you know, for the traveler. Um, it's for just as a kind of geographical descriptor, it's kind of located straight between Russia and Poland. So it's kind of like the eastern side of Europe, but pretty central. Like part of the importance of it is that it's literally the road from Moscow to Berlin. Like that runs straight through Belarus. So it's got this enormous strategic importance, especially for Russia, because it's literally the route you would take to invade invade Russia in that way. Um, but basically, the story of Belarus, like, is basically the story of one man, and that's the dictator of Belarus, a guy called Alexander Lukashenko, who has governed this country for 26 years since 1994. So that makes him, I believe, the longest running or longest standing non-royal head of state in Europe. So he's the longest kind of standing governor in Europe who is not a king or a queen, which is completely insane, really. Um, he's an interesting guy in his own way. He is almost like like the first and most successful like modern populist in Europe. So, you know, to listen to him, it's like a crazy kind of stream of consciousness. There's no like, there's almost like there's very little kind of uh, sense in what he says. Like he talks kind of in a kind of very unrestrained, a very kind of folksy way. You know, a lot of people have described him to me as like he's kind of like your crazy uncle or something. And you know, I go to Belarus quite a lot. I report on it, you know, as a journalist, and you know, his speech style is really quite something. You know, he's famous, or he was famous years ago for like always wearing the same jacket to kind of you know, show himself off as this like man of the people. Like, I've only got one jacket. He's a former pig farmer, for instance, so he's got this kind of like very strong kind of popular appeal. I've seen someone has asked like Trump, and like, do you know the thing is the first time I was ever in Belarus, someone's directly compared like he's literally a Russian speaking Trump. Like it's these kind of, you know, slightly non-sequitorial sentences, like, you know, that don't really seem to go anywhere. A lot of kind of unsubstantiated bragging goes on. He poses a lot of problems for translators, I can say that. But basically, his appeal for a really long time was that like Belarus has preserved a lot of the best bits or so-called best bits of the Soviet Union, which is like we kept the big factories running, we didn't privatize them, we didn't get oligarchs, we didn't get extremely rich people to kind of like to take over the economy and run it for their own ends. And for a long time that was really successful. People liked it, and they liked, you know, the guarantees of employment, the guarantees of healthcare, which you don't really get so much in Russia and Ukraine. You know, the two countries that are closest to Belarus and most comparable to them. But you do get them in Belarus, and a lot of people liked that. But it wasn't to last. a lot of it was built on like cheap Russian oil, which Russia is getting much less willing to give these days because of its own problems and because it doesn't really like the Belarusian government that much either. So the economy has been running into crisis for about 15 years now. It's not really worked. Like the Belarusian average wage has not, I believe, risen since 2010. So that's like, yeah, I mean, a lot of these like kind of promises that people received from Lukashenko, which is that like, I'm in charge of politics and, being involved in politics is not a thing that, you have a right to do, but I give you pretty like, broad social guarantees, healthcare, housing, employment. That's not worked so much recently. And that's really been a struggle for them. Belarus doesn't really have like friends in the international world. Um, Europe doesn't like it generally. The EU is very hostile because Belarus is a dictatorship with a horrendous human rights record. Russia is very iffy. Like Russia likes to say that it's very friendly with Belarus, but it's the the reality is more complex than that. Like Russia gets something from Belarus. Russia gets like loyalty from Belarus, but Belarus can't give Russia what it wants ultimately, which is to integrate very closely with Russia to the point where Belarus perhaps won't even be an independent state anymore. Belarus isn't willing to do that, so Russia isn't willing to pay the same kind of subsidies that it had in the past. So Belarus doesn't really have friends in the international arena so much anymore. Um, but what's happening now is basically actually about the coronavirus pandemic to a very large extent. So Lukashenko was very, very, very like dismissive of coronavirus. He said like it's a psychosis, it doesn't exist. Like, hey, do you see a virus? I don't see any virus. It means it doesn't exist. This kind of like just almost like kind of buffoonish kind of stuff. He said like, oh, if you get sick, just go and work in the fields on your tractor or drink vodka or, go to the sauna. And even if like the pandemic in Belarus hasn't been that bad by comparison to other countries, I think just for a lot of people it was really jarring to see like their leader just kind of wave it all away and say, oh, who cares? It's not my responsibility. I don't think people found that very unnerving because the basic deal behind the regime was basically like, yeah, we don't like, you don't get yourself involved in politics and I take care of everything. But he showed himself to be unable to take care of everything um, in the context of coronavirus, and it was just, yeah, it was a real problem for him. And then came an election. So Belarus already always had elections, but Lukashenko always wins them with 80% or 80% give or take, like a couple of percent either way. And they were kind of farces. They were faked. They were essentially like um, it's not even like rigging because the evidence suggests they didn't even really count the votes. They kind of came in prior to the election with a very clear idea of what Lukashenko would get and gave him that result, and then that was the end of it. But this year, because of the coronavirus crisis and him kind of embarrassing himself to such an extent, I think a lot of people basically said, look, this can't go on. This guy has been president for 26 years and he's failed utterly. The economy's in a decade-long stagnation period, and we've completely failed to fight coronavirus because of the president. So a bunch of really strong candidates ran for the presidency, and one of them basically was a woman called Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she was a really interesting candidate because her husband was a YouTuber who basically campaigned against corruption in Belarus, and he originally said he's going to run for president. Lukashenko, the dictator, then jailed him and only allowed his wife to run, thinking that, oh, a woman won't be able to get the same kind of support. He was completely wrong. She really, really strongly resonated. Her basic platform was like, I don't want to be here. I'm not a politician. I'm a wife and a mother. I'm a stay-at-home mother. I don't want to be here. I want to go and, be with my children. It was almost like a very kind of specific appeal to kind of diffuse the sexism from the dictator, actually. And she kind of said, look, if you elect me, I will resign in 6 months after organising new elections, and I'll make sure those elections are fair. And that the platform really, really resonated really strongly. Her last election meeting is, by some estimates, I think, and quite credible ones, the largest public event ever to have taken place in Belarus. So she did exceptionally well. And then on election night last Sunday, the election results come in and Lukashenko's got 80%. But no one believed it. And I think in the past people probably thought, well, maybe he would have got 60%, but in a fair election, he was genuinely popular. He would have got 60%, 65% or something. He might have won. But now he just wouldn't have won because he's lost his popularity because of coronavirus, because of the economy. And yeah, so people just didn't believe it, and there was an enormous outpouring of like real rage about it, and it really started to get quite grim on Sunday night. So people came out into the streets, and Lukashenko had already brought the army and the police and the riot police onto the streets, and there were fights, a lot of fights, and a lot of people were detained. And there were actually some really, really, really horrendous stories coming out about what the police did to protesters in captivity. I won't go into them now because they're pretty horrible. But the New York Times, the Financial Times, a site called Medusa, which writes about Russia in English, has written about this, and it's really, really horrendous. Like it's police brutality on absolute steroids. And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the candidate, was also in the firing line. So she went to the authorities to kind of put down a complaint saying, you faked this election. I have evidence and very credible evidence that I actually won 60% of the vote, beating Lukashenko enormously. And she vanished. She was detained in the office of the Central Electoral Commission, which is like the body that runs the election. Um, she vanished for about a day and then appeared a day later in Lithuania, which is the country next door over the border. And she said, I hope that no one ever goes through the choice that I had to make. And no one really knows why she vanished or why she left, but it has been suggested that her husband, who is in prison, was threatened was threatened by the authorities, and she left because of that. So yeah, that was kind of Monday night. On Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, it appeared that Lukashenko had won because the use of force was so overwhelming. There was tear gas, there were rubber bullets, there were water cannon on the streets, in a huge, huge crackdown. And then on Wednesday, I think something started to change because it became clear the extent, the brutality became very clear in how horrendous it was. So people came out. It was there was footage from the prisons, people being tortured, people being threatened with rape. There was a horrendous spot on the state news channel of kind of 6 young kids who'd been arrested during protests, and they'd obviously been beaten to an absolute pulp. And there was a voice off camera saying, "Are you going to do a revolution?" No, 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 of course not. And this stuff really radicalized people. And on Thursday, it all started to change. On the morning after this violence, it really started to change. Um, you know, a huge number of women came onto the streets, and that was really crucial because I don't think the riot police were willing to attack women in the same way. And these women's marches kind of grew into huge rallies, huge opposition rallies, just more than the number of riot police in the country could cope with. There might be 6,000 riot police officers in the whole country. And, we're talking probably hundreds of thousands on the streets. And then even more importantly, the factories started to strike. So I mentioned before that kind of part of Lukashenko's original appeal was that he saved the big Soviet era factories. And the guys working, the blue collar workers, are supposed to be his core constituency. But they came out on strike. They said, the president is illegitimate. He clearly did not win. And we're striking until he leaves. And that's basically the entire economy. The entire economy was just brought to a standstill. So you've got the huge kind of manufacturing sector has just ended. The metro in Minsk is done. That's the capital of Belarus. The airline is on strike. Just the whole country on a massive general strike. And this has really, really put Lukashenko in a difficult position because that has been kind of matched by some evidence that the police and the army are saying things like, uh, we don't want to be here, we don't want to do this, we're with the people, not with the government, and there is increasingly a very it's hard to see how much support he really commands at this point. Um, so yeah, it's that's I think where we are now. Having answered those questions, kind of what's happening and kind of why is it happening, I suppose what I want to look at, what I want to think about now is like what might happen next. And in Belarus, like the big component of the story is always Russia because it's right next door. Um, it's generally a country that that attaches a great deal of importance to having power over internationally and its international reputation. Belarus has very deep treaty commitments to Russia. It's theoretically an ally, but kind of as I mentioned earlier, that's not really the case. Um, Lukashenko today says he rang Putin and said, I need help. I don't have I don't have the weight. I can't get out of this position anymore. There's been a lot of speculation that Russia could invade Belarus, whether to support Lukashenko or just to incorporate it into Russia. I don't agree. I think that's very unlikely. Because I think like Belarus would be quite a difficult country to attack. I think that the amount of unrest on the street now is just incredibly. It's beyond. I think Putin would be very worried about us taking on those kind of obligations to quiet down this disturbance of this extent. Um, so, I mean, I think at this point it's quite hard to imagine Lukashenko staying in office much longer. But I think it is very possible. I think, like, in a lot of ways, the dictatorship is just crumbling. Dictatorships are much more built on fear than they are on actual violence, and just the fear is just gone. You can see on Twitter or in the New York Times is doing very good coverage of this at the moment, of just like Minsk filled with protesters, and that's just extraordinary. You would never have had that before. However, it's probably still quite hard to see how Lukashenko goes because he just has such an intense command on of the country, and it's really really difficult to push harder. Someone has asked, how is life in general in Belarus apart from corruption of the government? Sounds like the Hunger Games. Okay, so like, no, not really. It's not. Minsk, as I mentioned at the start of this like stream, it's incredibly clean and tidy and stable. And in many ways, a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, whose countries are less clean, tidy, and stable, less equal, less, I suppose, livable places, have often been a little bit like, in a strange way, envious of Belarus because Belarus had this deal where, like, okay, we're a dictatorship, but we've got all these like side benefits, um, and that I think is part of the reason why Lukashenko survived for so long. He's a strange kind of figure because, as someone's mentioned in the comments as well, like, it is surprising. He's a pig farmer. He's not, even in the Soviet Union, he was not like the ruling class. He was not some kind of big, politician guy. He came from literally nowhere to become president, and he has survived because he figured out what his people wanted for a very long time. But that deal that he made with them just isn't working anymore. And I think that is basically what's happening now. Do you think Putin is concerned about what the example this sets for the Russian people? In a word, yes. So there is, Belarus is incredibly closely intertwined with Russia. So Belarusians have and Russians have the right to live in each other's countries, to work in each other's countries, no visas, no passports, no anything. They can go and come as they absolutely please. I live in Moscow most of the time, and it is absolutely full of Belarusians. So there is a huge resonance of this country here in Russia. There is also unrest in Russia. In the far east of Russia, there's a big, long line of protests that have been going on for months now, or not months, weeks. And I think that is a big worry. Um, do I think that will lead him to do anything rash? Probably not at this point, because I think Belarus is probably dependent enough on Russia that Putin can figure out a way to achieve leverage over any potential future Belarusian president, I think. So I would not bet on a big kind of military outcome. Okay, this is a good question. How comparable is the situation in 2014 Ukraine? Are the protesters demanding reorientation towards the EU, or would a new government remain in the Russian sphere? The answer to that is really, really interesting. Basically, it's very unlike Ukraine for a load of reasons. But I'm going to focus on the one that you mentioned at the end. The protesters are not anti-Russian. If anything, they are just anti-Lukashenko. They want the basic platform of the opposition there is like we want, broadly speaking, the foreign policy of Lukashenko, but we want it, done democratically and by a president who is, more legitimate and who doesn't beat us up and torture us in his prisons. Um, there is not, I would suggest, a realistic prospect of Belarus going like Ukraine and trying to, stating its intention to join NATO, join the EU, because Belarus is overwhelmingly pro-Russian. Not necessarily pro-Putin or pro-Kremlin, but there is a strong emotional and cultural tie to Russia. It is seen as the closest country. Belarusians are work in Russia in enormous numbers. They're hugely economically dependent on Russia. So not be, I would not predict a sort of Ukraine-style situation. Okay, I read Tikhanovskaya wanted to leave the country and go to Lithuania to have her safety and her family's safety. Did she left? She did. She has gone to Lithuania. She's been there for a while, largely because she was like blackmailed out of the country, it seems, by the government, probably threatening her husband who's in jail and still in Belarus. However, she's kind of resurfaced recently, and I think this is a symbol of how weak Lukashenko is at this point, that she's kind of pushing initiatives like a kind of national council to transfer for power to transfer, because I think, you know, if Lukashenko suddenly falls, she's probably the obvious choice to become a kind of interim president. Maybe, I'm not saying that with any kind of inside knowledge, but I would suspect that given she almost certainly won the election on Sunday. But she has gone, and she may be back in future. It really depends on what happens now. Okay, were you surprised by how conspicuously the power balance shifted back to the protesters? Yes. Yes, I was. I really, really was. So I went through several stages of thinking on this. On Monday night, I thought the scale of the protests and, crucially, the degree of resistance to the riot police in Minsk was like, Lukashenko is gone. I don't think he can re-establish control over Minsk after this. On Wednesday and no, sorry, on Tuesday and Wednesday, I went completely the other way, and I started to think like, yeah, he's got this, because he actually turned off the internet for a bit, which stopped the protesters being able to organize. So the protesters don't really have any obvious leader because Tikhanovskaya is out of the country, and most of it's actually done through Telegram, which is an encrypted messenger app. So if this happens, this will be like probably the first revolution entirely, carried out through social media. Um, but I will say I was completely stunned by what happened on Thursday and Friday, with the scale of the strikes and the scale of like the protests that broke out, the peaceful kind of female-led protests. And that's another fascinating element of this. This has been in almost every way like a women's revolution. Like, it has been consistently like men have failed to take the fight to the regime, and women have succeeded. Like, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams as an opposition candidate against Lukashenko by the amount of popular mobilization she achieved and how compelling her pitch was. And then the women who came out on Wednesday, not specifically to take down the regime, but to just say no to violence, which I think was implicitly against the regime, but not specifically. So yes, I have been stunned, and I think a lot of it's about gender, and a lot of it's also about like the power of like organized labor. So I think if Lukashenko ends up going, it will be because these strikes have made his position completely untenable. Um, you can't govern, you can't force, you can batten protesters. You cannot kind of force workers back into the factories. They can just not work. They can call in sick. this will be the deciding feature. Okay, I've got another question here. I've heard people describe the Belarusian economy as significantly state-owned. Is this true? And how did this play out during independence? Did Belarus see the kind of collapse in living standards that happened in the ex-USSR? It is true. As I said, like the big factories that I was talking about just now are mostly state-owned, and that's why strikes in them are such a crippling blow to the regime. You know, it deprives of its revenue source. It's absolutely crushing. It's a crushing blow. Belarus, regarding the collapse in living standards, it did, but it wasn't as dramatic, simply because Lukashenko came to power at the right time. You know, in 1994, when Lukashenko became president, the economy was kind of getting ready to turn around already. So it was like, he was able to manipulate that by not, by not privatizing enterprises, by not seeing the creation of an oligarch class, which is what you have in Russia and especially in Ukraine. He did keep living standards stable, but this as an idea has failed more recently. Like, he hasn't been able to deliver on these kind of rising living standards, stability in at least 10 and possibly 15 years now. So yeah, it's kind of at this point it's more like a fond memory of what was a myth than a reality, I would say. Um, I think that is probably it for today, unless anyone's got any other questions, which I'd be happy to answer. But if not, I'll say thank you for tuning in. And we have got a new question. Okay, traditional gender roles in Belarus, where women are expected to be housewives, etc. Yes, there are. But I think this is one of those moments where actually the mood of the people has kind of outstripped the government. So Lukashenko said a lot of things about how, like, don't be ridiculous, a woman can't be president, she should go home and, look after her children. And in many ways, she kind of, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, this is the candidate against Lukashenko, played into this. She said, I'm not a politician, I am a housewife, I want to be at home, like, looking after my children. Um, and that kind of deactivated the charge, I suppose. However, what we have seen apart from that is her campaign team, which is mostly women, who are part of a kind of maybe slightly more Europeanized, urbanized, white-collar section of Belarusian society that has maybe left some of these more archaic ideas behind, I would suggest. So yeah, again, gender, a very important theme here. All right, thank you guys very much, and everyone who's spoken today. I've been really enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again soon.